So from our perspective, and there are a couple institutes that have really good resources on this, and I mentioned the Open Data Institute is probably one that I've seen that has the most reports out there. But they use the terminology of a data institution. And the thinking of this really is an institution that enables organizations who are managing data to work in collaborative partnership. And there are different models for this, often within a civic context. You may see this for a transportation or open data initiative where a lot of different public and private sources come together to pull that information to enable individual parties to select pieces of the data or perhaps look at aggregate or benchmark information across sources. And the reason that I would summarize that trust or this mechanism even exists is to help the different partners come to the table, both from an infrastructure level to share their data across. So what does that data ingest and the APIs between them, who manages that and how does that function? But in addition to that, setting up the data sharing mechanism and policy and governance to enable data sharing across the different, and use really, across the different types of players. In a civic context, one might say if you're entering an open data partnership, you know your data is open and that it could be used potentially for any purpose. But in some cases, our data trust is a good example. We're looking specifically at usage and engagement data for books. And some publishers have that information and treat it as very sensitive. Other institutions feel that that can be public. And there are some challenges comparing apples to oranges when you think of the data around what does it mean when I look at a book, especially around ebooks. Are we looking at information beyond citations and download to do different types of analytics? Is that information sensitive? Is that information personal? How do we grapple with those issues as an ecosystem of stakeholders to then be able to enable us to get analytics at an aggregate, more privacy protective way? So I think that's some of the issues we're trying to grapple with, recognizing there's so many data streams held across. And I would say data one is a good example of what this could look like in the natural sciences. So Josh, I saw you, please.
Yeah, can I ask a question about that? So yeah. Tell me if I'm misunderstanding. So when you're talking about, say, individual level data about reading, is the is navigating is that data is stewarded by a set of institutions, and that they're basically negotiating and striking a relationship in order to interoperate at that sort of company or institution level. And they're basically doing that on behalf of their respective users?
On behalf, well, there's a lot of on behalf of. At the end of the day, within scholarly communication, a lot of that comes back to the author and kind of the author use case, but there is also institutional use cases in higher ed. So how are open access books being used within classrooms? How are they being used to further education? How are they being used to support, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And so looking at not only citations and downloads as a summary number, as a raw output, but putting that in the context of all of these different areas requires the data to be connected. It has to be linked data at the end of the day. So you have to look at things like a syllabi for the reference for a book to be able to then compare that open access use downstream. So enabling those linkages, especially for smaller organizations who may not have the technical capacity to have a team of data analysts to build something, or the financial resource capacity to buy into a number of different services, is some of the value propositions that we're exploring in our project. And I should note, our project is a 2-year pilot. The other thing I just want to clarify, Josh, for you, is that we're not looking at individual reader habits. We have a no PII, like there's no personally identifiable information, and we're not looking at individual reading, but it's really around how a title is used, open access ebook.
But and I think I want to push on this a little bit to make sure that I'm understanding, because
Yes.
you can not identify an individual person. You can not have PII, but there are individual level traces of activity that then, when aggregated, give insight. I guess the core question to me, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding this right, because I think I have a framing of data trusts as a mechanism for enabling the work at an aggregate level around data from multiple sources. I'm trying to frame this as generically as possible.
Yes.
Which functions by literally delegating various independent interests in data to a trustee who is able to operate on behalf of a set of individuals, because they've all essentially, that the data trust serves a normalizing function to be able to enable interoperability at a ownership, consent, you can pick your governance frame kind of level. And so when you're talking about and I take your point that there are a number of different kinds of competing interests, but if you're ultimately looking at use of, say, ebooks, yeah, it was the question of sort of on whose behalf is this a trustee? Is this trust operating? That's I guess the question I want to get at.
And I think that's a wonderful way to think about this, because part of what we found in our work is the diversity of stakeholders and who those trustees are. And the way our project has approached the data trust is not that there's a singular trustee, but that each of those stakeholders need to be a trustee at the table. And there has to be a solution that is tied back to those individual use cases for the different types of stakeholders. So the authors and the scholars, like if we start with them, they have a very particular need. And something I've been doing a lot of the design thinking use case work with our communities. And what we see is everyone wants to provide some type of reporting back to the authors that they're working with. Those authors in turn need to provide it into their institutions, or within university and the library at higher ed here in the US, they may want to report on what their OA collections are doing, or with respect to specific disciplines, what is going on. I think there are different trustee perspectives at the table, and each one of those stakeholders, be it public or private, be it potentially with competing interests, still need to agree on the rules of the road. And I think that's where the trust comes in, much like, I don't know if folks on this call are familiar with a framework called collective impact. But I think in a similar fashion to collective impact, which is kind of a terminology for how do you bring together very disparate groups to work together on very big social challenges from where they sit, from their own perspective, and using the tools that they have in their own organization. I think a data trust functions in a similar way in that it's a neutral backbone organization, but it has to recognize that each of these organizations in their own right have that kind of empowerment as a trustee. So, they don't have to join the trust, but if a trustee and their organization comes into the trust, then they need to agree on, here's our shared rules, our shared governance, our shared policy. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out here. And how you develop that and sustain that is perhaps some of the biggest challenges that we're trying to tease out. Especially if it's not clear that I used a civic context with open data initiatives. That makes it easy if, okay, all the data you're putting in, we're going to be sharing openly. The data trust we're working with, that's not necessarily clear yet. We're still figuring out what could be shared. Is it sensitive information that can't be shared, but we want to pull it in so that we can do aggregate benchmark data on top to be shared out. So different values. Is that clear for those of you who are just joining this and learning about this topic? What questions do you have, given kind of our conversation thus far?
I think like the use cases are quite interesting. I think they kind of help at making it like understandable, like what different kind of actors could come together under a trust. So also to kind of highlight that might be different from a lot of like just open infrastructures coming together. So this is like not, you can have, as you said, like commercial actors in here. So I think use cases are definitely helpful. In my head, this is just like potentially a big, complicated legal mess that you're creating. And I'm like that makes it a little bit scary, because I don't really know how you would untangle that, make sure you record consent at every level and things like that. So that's like something where I'm like, this is really complicated.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say, and Christine, I'd be curious if you would agree with this. The way I think about it is that the world is a lot cleaner when you're working in a purely open model where, well, maybe the right way that I like to think about it is an unencumbered model where you're from a legal perspective, from an ethical perspective, from a whole lot of different perspectives, you don't have to worry about negotiating these things at a given level. You just, if something is open access, it's out there in the world, and the presumption is go to town. But there's a lot of cases where that isn't the case, and there are different interests that, for one reason or another, need to be protected. And those interests can be ownership interests in the context of reconciling copyright. Those can be personal data interests in the realm of sort of privacy or autonomy. They can be indigenous interests in like, I think that's another potentially interesting context of data trusts. But to me, I feel like, as I understand the sort of burgeoning area of work around data trust, it's fundamentally about exactly how to do that. Really, I mean, if you were going to say, hey, I want to archive a piece of software in a way that other people can archive, can just, run it, or that it can be interoperable with a piece of software somebody else archived, that requires a tremendous amount of technical standardization and negotiation so that just works. And there's about the equivalent level of technical, complicated legal and policy work to be done to make that kind of interoperability function, and that trustee relationship. Because again, I keep thinking in terms of dependencies and sort of delegation of responsibility. Quite literally, if someone is going to be a trustee of my data, then I am delegating a certain amount of autonomy to them, and I trust them to act accordingly. And it is complicated as heck, and there's a lot of work to be done on this front. But it also opens up the realm of doing a whole lot of stuff that we just can't do in the world where we're only working with stuff that's open.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that sounds like a lot of what we're working on our 2-year project. I was going to say, I absolutely are. I feel everything you just described, because there's the infrastructure piece, which I think we talk a lot about at the RDA, and the technical standards, interoperability. What are the APIs? How do we get the data to play well together when they're from different industries? Like, even with something as simple as OA ebooks for scholarly communication, we have everything coming from the commercial publishers with ISBNs, and then we have Counter, which is a usage standard. And so we're actually putting in something to talk at NISO about what does this mean for emerging standards, and where are the gaps when you're using different vocabularies, essentially, across the different stakeholders to pull into one system. That's a standards and a technologies piece. But then you have the data sharing agreement and the different elements of data. We talked about personally identifiable information. We're cutting off IP addresses, so you don't have to worry about geolocation. But where this gets tricky is ORCID IDs. ORCID IDs are personally identifiable. If we want to be able to empower authors to look at how their books are performing, then at some point you need to introduce that personally identifiable information so they can bring that information back. And what does that mean in the context of a trust? A lot of that layer for us really looks at data access and data control. What are the privacy controls, the security controls, and then the policy and agreements that need to be layered around that, so that all the trustees understand and have a say, really, around how that information can be used on behalf of their own stakeholders, so that it doesn't compromise what they are entrusted with as kind of individual trustees of the data they bring to the table. What do you think?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I don't feel like I have the answers yet. We're very much still learning. So this is
Yeah.
a very new field.
I mean, the thing I was going to say that I don't know if this is helpful, but so there's a particular use case that I've had a bunch of conversations around and have been sort of sniffing around that in some ways is less complicated than the one that you're describing, which is so right now, one of the most exciting areas of social science research is the fact that there's a tremendous amount of human behavior that is now happening digitally and is potentially tracked or trackable. And you can run experiments, you can do observational studies. There's a huge amount of stuff that is happening on large scale digital platforms where that data is fully, where there's a complicated set of interests in that data. And so to date, the way that, say, a political scientist who wants to ask questions about the role of Facebook in democracy works is they go to Facebook and they ask permission to get access to the data. And that sets up power dynamics, that sets up a whole lot of structural issues. There have been attempts to put organizational structures in place around that kind of data. They have not been to date successful. And so there are folks who have a different approach and say, like there's a different way at it. Rather than thinking about platform side data access, think about user side data collection. What if I used a browser extension and collected all my own data? So let's imagine I did that and I wanted to contribute that data into all the things I looked at, all the things I collected myself, and I want to contribute that in to a large scale longitudinal study of political discourse on Facebook, for example, or something else. This looks a lot like the way the most realized infrastructure for this is what Apple did with its HealthKit platform. So if you have an Apple device, an iPhone, a watch, whatever, there's a personal data locker on it, which is aggregating health and biometric data, and it is encrypted locally. But they have, with NIH funding and working with others, they have developed protocols to enable individuals to contribute their data into medical research and even clinical trials. Yeah. So there's a really interesting question about technically pooling data like that is interesting, but at a policy perspective, what if I want to put that data out there, but I don't want to do it openly and let anybody do anything with it they want? What if I want to vet what are the research questions that researchers are going to use my data to answer? What if I say I don't want that there are certain things that I want as off limits with my whether it's my genomic data or my browsing data or whatever else? And so the idea is that I should be like, that's a lot of work for me to vet each one of those studies, and I won't necessarily have the expertise to do so. So the question is, can I find a trust to which I can contribute my data that will have stated policies that align with mine, and that I basically delegate authority in the same way as a living will delegates a certain amount of autonomy to whomever I designate to make decisions on my behalf. And so there, it's not so much organization to organization; it's really collective in collecting up individual data, individual level data, and aggregating it into something that's meaningful, that's more than the sum of the parts. And doing that in a sense, and doing that through a set of legal mechanisms that don't just rely on me trusting that organization, lowercase t trusting, but actually, having controls in place where they are, in a fiduciary sense, required to behave in a way responsible to that original agreement. So that's sort of a less complicated version of this, but for about the past year, I've been having conversations and trying to understand better. Again, starting with sort of genomic and health data, which is the most sort of, opened up version. And Patricia, I think Open Humans is, I'm trying to remember, but my sense is that is largely, oh, yes. Because I think, is Open Humans like purely open data? Do you know?
I forgot. It's been a while since I donated some of my data to it, and I'm not sure if you can set any restrictions if you're
right.
If you're contributing.
I can't remember the way they think about it. And it's an interesting, complicated use of the word open, because I don't think the data is fully open where anybody can do anything with it. But I also don't think they have a full, the sort of rigorous apparatus of data trust sitting on top. So it's kind of a thing that's held together out of good intentions. But I think down the road, you know, anyhow, that's these are the kinds of issues that I find really interesting around this area of work.
Yeah, it's funny. So in the spirit of conversation, wearing a different hat in a previous job, I got to work on an initiative called Smart Columbus, which is it's a public-private data initiative here in Columbus, Ohio, that was looking to pull regional data and compile that with transportation information and a number of research projects to see what innovation that could empower and whether that could improve some of our civic services here on a local level. And I was on the policy working team, given my privacy background. And something that we put together was a wonderful, not only the data management plan, but a data privacy plan that talks about those, not only the security controls, but the privacy controls that had to be in place and the structures around use. And a lot of the conversation that comes up in data ethics. How do you do the cost benefit analysis? How does a data curator decide? How do you involve the community in those decisions about how data can and can't be shared or used or ingested into that, that mechanism? But I think the challenge for sustainability is how do you fund that component over time? Given that often folks, I think about the technical means, how do you get the technology funded and sustained? But then there's this policy community engagement layer that still needs to happen to ensure that not only do people have faith in the system, but that people engage with it. So I think that's something where there was a plan, but like all plans, they still have to be managed and the community needs to be engaged going forward. So it was that project, goodness, about 3 years down the road, and that was a US Department of Transportation funded effort. And there's a foundation that funded that as well. Vulcan, I think, came in on that one. But it's the same thing where it's okay, well, now who gets entrusted with it? Is it a national or in this case, state government initiative, and they sustain it over time with then all the rules applied that apply to state government? I think it's an open question.
I want to say something. The data, it's hard to say that we own the data because sometimes the data comes from you, but it is not stored by you. Like you use a cell phone and some tracking data, you cannot provide them because you cannot self-report this data without actually interacting with the tool. So I think it's hard to solve this problem. And another thing is that I'm really curious about why ebook cares about the data trust so much, because different domains may need different needs based on this question, and the healthcare concerns the privacy, but ebook, I think their goals of the book is to let people to read. So I think it's not concerns about data trust. Could you explain more?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So with the open access books in particular, the authors and their publishers really want to have as many individuals access the book and use the book. So often those materials are published in multiple repositories or have multiple access points on the internet, is a good way to describe this. And with that, they have, if we wanted to tell the story of a book, you would have to look across all those different access points. And that's where the data trust comes in to engage all those different players to say, okay, how can we tell the story of a single book or a single title across all the different places one might be able to get it? And so it's combining that information with individual systems and setting up the rules through which you could think about that high level information around, here's what use looks like worldwide, without also sharing potentially sensitive information about a given publisher's performance or a given provider, or like some of the services that people use, maybe only 10% access comes through a paid service, while 80% comes through another free service. The publisher would want to know that information. The author may want to know that information, but does that information need to be public? People have different opinions on that answer. I'm not in a position to answer that question, but I think having a sense of that data is what people are trying to figure out right now. Can you tell the story with an aggregate level of information to put it into context without ignoring the sensitive nature of some of this information, especially when it engages either how people use things in their scholarly work, scholarly freedom implications, as well as, I think, funding implications for individuals down the road.
So this data trust is more about let readers trust the ebook, or let readers trust to provide their own data.
It's more the organizations that distribute ebooks and how they can take the information about who is accessing those titles online and how
Like
they're
the
using it.
recommendation system.
It could be through citations or downloads, but it also could be in reference to other projects. So the Open Syllabus project is a great example where you could potentially see titles referenced within syllabi to be able to bring those pieces of data together to then say, for, in our case, here's how a singular title is used in classrooms. Or with the open citations, here's how it is cited. And if there's a way to pull all that together to tell the full story and a robust story of a book for its author and for its host institution, I think that's what we're exploring.
Okay, so it's going to build a journey map, the user journey map of a book after they publish what these books are going to experiencing through, something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to drop in our website, and we could talk about the data trust. It's funny, I've given many presentations on the work we're doing around OA ebooks, but I wanted to give everyone a moment to stay focused on kind of these bigger challenges. And I know we have a couple new folks who have just joined us. So Catherine, and again, if you would like to introduce yourself and just share a moment what interests you in this particular topic and what perspective you bring. It's a very small group, so we kind of have shifted around on our agenda a bit to talk about what we're looking at.
So yeah, thank you for being gracious about people sort of with overlapping regular work things dropping in.
Of course, it's the life of 2020.
Yes, and you can call me Katie. And I admit, I was just, because I was late, I haven't read your abstract yet, but I'm interested in the concepts of governance. And so I thought, oh, that looks like a relevant task. And I mean, I think I've had different exposures to it. I've worked in libraries and a data archive, and now work on institutional data use agreements. I'm thinking about how data from commercial providers, I'm like the ultimate cheerleader of the win-win agreement, and trying to figure out something that will work with both parties. And I think, and also people use the word data governance, I think, in so many different ways. So just trying to sort of track and see how that's used.
Yeah, I could talk to you for an hour, I'm sure.
Oh, okay.
So many of those issues.
Well, your name looks familiar, so I don't know if we've met before or not. So
yeah, right. Well, thank you and welcome. And we might chip into some brainstorming here in a moment, given that perspective, because the purpose of this Birds of a Feather, when Cameron and I put it together, was to really see who else is out there working on these challenges, and to see if enough of us were struggling with the same types of questions that it made sense for us to come together and potentially form an interest group to see if we wanted to work in tandem. So we can shift in that brainstorming in a moment, but I also wanted to see, I know we had a fifth person join us as well here. So if you want to say hello, someone from the SSHRC.
Hi, my name is Ariane. I'm from SHRG, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada. And yeah, I in the last couple of years, I've worked a lot on data governance and trying to bring some sense to our organization, but also a lot of other research organizations in Canada to be able to better share and compare our data across mainly there are three main funding agencies, but also across Canada. So that's why I'm here.
Excellent. And I should note for those of you who have the link to the, I'm going to drop this back in the chat because I don't know if you see the history, but we have collaborative notes. So if individuals want to, feel free to add or annotate anything. I'm trying to take notes as best I can. But just know we also are being recorded. So that's a good footnote for all of us as well, just to know in the background. I think you might have seen that when you came in, but just as a heads up, that's something the RDA had asked us to do. So we were having a conversation around what data trusts, data collaboratives, data institutions are, and how, in my experience, working on one specific to open access ebook usage data, as well as past experience working on one around smart transportation data in a civic agency context here in the United States. I brought both of those to bear here to really think about what does that mean for governance? How can we explore sustainability and networks, given those two projects? I have my perspective. And one of the things we wanted to do, especially given those of you who just introduced yourselves, would be perhaps to brainstorm what some of the challenges have been that you maybe have encountered in your work. And so I'm going to share a quick link here in the Zoom chat. For those of you who haven't worked with GroupMap before, this is just a virtual workboard that allows us to kind of drop in virtual stickies. And so you should be able to log in and see something that looks like a quad chart with a white, yellow, blue, and green quadrant. And what perhaps might be helpful here is to take 4 minutes. And we can talk as we do this, but I'm a huge fan of, especially for those who don't feel like talking because it's the early or late in the day, but just take a moment to contribute our ideas as they come, or if they're already in our mind of what could potentially be useful given the challenges we've seen. So to start, instead of thinking about solutions, I wanted to give us the opportunity to put our stickies up on this virtual board, if you will, of what challenges you've seen or you've personally faced in your work, putting this together. And so, to start us off, and everyone will probably see this when I put it here. So the project with my open access ebook usage, which we call OA-EBU for short, with that project in mind, something for us that's been a challenge is developing the data sharing agreements across public and private partners, because there are so many different requirements, and we could probably have our own in-house international legal counsel, but alas, we're a small research project. So that's hopefully, as I do this and hit enter, does everyone see that on their screen? Wonderful. So why don't we just take a quick 60 seconds, and if you have anything you want to add to this, please put it up on here, and then we can kind of reflect and discuss from there.
May I ask 2 questions?
Please.
So one, the screen, I'm not sure. Do we click join or do we enter our email address? How does that?
You can click join. You should be able to jump
Okay.
right in. It should be set up so you can be anonymous.
Am I clicking the gray? Am I the only person who's having problems getting in? Is everybody else on track and it's just me?
And you just click the screen wherever you want to add your idea, and a little text box should pop up. Let's see, we have 8
Oh,
participants.
excuse me
now.
just a moment.
Please.
Okay, I neglected to hit next. That was my user error.
Oh, okay. No worries. Is that
And then,
working? Please.
and then for, for the purposes that you're using, do you have just brief working definitions for like collaborations and trusts and how you're thinking about them? Or is
I
that
think
like
I
a big
wanted to
can
have-
of worms to open up?
It's no, I meant it as expansive as possible. So,
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do is find, the other birds of a feather. So
Yeah.
we're using data trust because our project, the OAEBU project specifically, is looking at that legal trust model for the data cooperative. But there are data commons, data collaboratives. There are a lot of words for this. The Open Data Institute, which I believe the link was in the abstract under the RDA plenary's agenda, but that particular group they call them data institutions. So these, the other term, well, this is a loaded term in the United States, but the other term you could use is a data broker. Those who really sit in the middle, who broker the exchange of data, but who also can empower kind of the higher level analytics because the data is now linked and managed. What does that look like if instead of it being a monetized data brokerage system, if it's managed by a community and sustained by a community? And so I think I wouldn't quite call this a data broker. I would add that we have to have some kind of community governance, which is where that trustee model comes from to manage it. Do others share that perspective? I mean, that's the way I've seen the world, but by no means am I an expert. What do others
That's
think?
helpful. Thank you.
Is that, Kevin, is that how you see it as well and what you've encountered to date? It looks like we have a number of ideas on here. I'd love to kind of open up this floor for discussion. If we want to go around quickly and just describe what we put up on the board. And as we do this, I should just note, if individuals have additional ideas, please, by all means, drop them in. And if, as we're having this discussion, if individuals want to add to their ideas, you can double click any of the little virtual post-its we just put up there and add additional details and comments. So just for the sake of kind of illustration, I put up a couple post-its on here. One of the things that I wouldn't say is necessarily a struggle, but something that we were lucky enough to have resources to do, since my position wasn't traveling all year to conferences, was to make the time to develop clear use cases for the trust and to understand the needs of the different stakeholders prior to going in, and understand not only their needs, but how they are differentiated so that, it's not as simple as public and private or open and closed, but we could understand where the power of that data is. The data sharing agreements, I see up here that multilateral component, I would say international as well, is something that we're trying to manage. Our data controller is in Australia for our research project. And so we have a project team that is in England and the United States as well. So figuring out how to do that is something we're trying to think through, and where the data should live long-term is an open question. And then the other post that I put up here was under launching, finding ways to design a data trust in all of its mechanisms, be it its governance or its technology, so that we can really engage lower resource institutions who may not have data analysts on staff, who may not have the dollars to pay a large sum for access to data. What does that mean? What does that look like? So those are the ones I've added. How about others? Who would like to go first? Anyone? Or are there any on
I'll go
here
first,
that you'd
but I'll
like to
be
discuss?
quick. I'll go first, but I'll be quick. That I saw somebody had put up data sharing agreements, and something I see potential in is multilateral data sharing agreements. And the content, I mean, in terms of what you could have is multiple, what you sometimes have is multiple parties, each of whom are sharing data. And also just another very run-of-the-mill scenario is you have researchers based at 2 different institutions, and it's very challenging to get a data use agreement for a multi-institutional research project. Not because anybody's attorneys are trying to be difficult, but I mean, I think a lot of research infrastructure is very institutional based, including the legal infrastructure. So that's friction in the system, I see.
I added a comment from our end. We so appreciate that because we are also a research project, and we are, well, we are what, 6 months into negotiating the data share agreements just for the research project, much less an operational trust. So we understand. This was the easy one where it's like, it's just limited to the project.
So I have a comment. This is Ariane. I'll put that, sorry, I had little people around me earlier. So yeah, one of the things that I end up thinking a lot about when we try to look at lots of different sources of data is the biases that can come in each data set that we will either multiply or erase, or erase the effect that we want to see, right? If we're trying to find if there is a bias, and then we put that with another data set, then that will disappear. So that's one of the things that I think can, not knowing enough about each data set sometimes can really lead to that type of stuff. And I don't know how, even if we put a lot of information on each data set, how we can fully understand each data set is beyond me sometimes. So that was my, that's what I'm thinking of right now.
Really helpful. I've seen a lot of conversations around that in the data ethics space, where organizations are grappling with that. In the US, we've heard it referred to as the risk assessment. It's either like a privacy impact assessment, but the ethical impact assessment, or that cost benefit analysis, because sometimes with their biases, there's a benefit for like including that, but there's also a cost. And so figuring out how you do that weighting is incredibly challenging. And I know I would love to understand other models that are out there outside of the US context. Are there any other items on here that folks would like to discuss? Hearing none, we can jump. I was going to say we can go back to our conversation. This truly is I meant this as a very informal birds of a feather, because as I said at the beginning of the session, I'm not in a position to say, hey, here are all the answers and the recommendations, because I think this is very much a forming area. But one of the things that we wanted to have the opportunity to talk about here is who's doing this well. Do you know of efforts that are already underway where you look to them and you have elements that you admire? So I had mentioned earlier the Smart Columbus project I was on, and I'll put the link here. But the privacy, the data privacy plan was, I think, one of those things where I have heard from a number of folks that it was great because it was very comprehensive in terms of the security and access controls and the privacy controls or mechanisms that would be put into place to ensure that the expectation of how the data would be used would be managed. And so I don't know if there are other examples folks have out there of things that they've seen that they've admired, or teams that are doing things really well right now. Or if there's none, that's okay too. Maybe that's what we think.
Well, and if you're thinking about sort of an interest group, sometimes questions can be as useful as answers. And I bet that a lot of that good practice is sort of hidden and people don't necessarily talk about it.
It might also be because it's like, you know, at least to me, the concept of a data trust was fairly new. So people might be doing it, but they don't know that they're doing it. And they don't know that, you know, they might be actually what is current best practice. And thus are, you know,
I really agree.
Hesitant to share because at least like from, I think that like often, especially if it comes, you know, there's a lot of legalese involved. You're never entirely sure if like your lawyers are super happy with your sharing agreements, and at least when I worked with lawyers on data sharing agreements, I always felt out of my depth. So I had like, you know, if you had asked me, I would never have put my hand up and said like, yeah, we're doing something good that that someone could learn from, because you always feel like an imposter, because every conversation you go in with your lawyers, you're glad if you understand half of it when you leave the room. So yeah, I think that might be yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to pitch that to get people involved and happy and you know, get them to share. I'm pretty sure there are good examples out there, but I'm not entirely sure if people would necessarily give themselves that label.
Along those lines, another resource, and I'll drop this into the notes, but for those of you, and Adrienne, you might find this useful, but I just came across this call recently that the Open Data Institute and Microsoft are partnering to put together a peer learning network. So something I think similar to what this BoF could do, but to help organizations that are thinking about these data collaborations move forward. I don't know much about it, so I was going to say I could share the link, but just as a reference for folks who are working in this space, they could potentially have some answers as well. Let's see here. Thank you everyone for dropping your ideas into that group map. I think there's a lot of room here. I apologize because I'm updating notes as I'm facilitating. It's always fun.
I'm going to put in Patricia's last point that the concepts, I mean, just like as I had asked, the concepts are sort of new and people are probably doing it without even realizing it. So.
Yeah, and the piece that I think is, you know, in my experience, perhaps a little different as we shift to thinking of a data commons, or, you know, what Data One has with the repository of repositories. What are when we think of a data trust in that legal mechanism, what are the legal mechanisms in terms of data sharing agreements, or the ability to opt in and opt out, and to select different rights and access privileges that would be unique to a trust? Is that unique to a trust? Because I feel like it is a perhaps more complex version of an open data commons, where you put everything in and it's open. And they were like, well, we want to protect pieces of the data in there in different ways. And some of it people have access to, some of it don't. Some of it we're going to put together in a certain way, some of it we won't. And so knowing how, even figuring out how to do that is something that I think perhaps is new, but maybe it isn't. I often find myself thinking about the privacy world. I have a background in privacy, and it's people have often thought about data elements that have privacy impacts with a lot of those control components in the conversation. You know, who has access to this? So we talked about health earlier. If we think of our health records broken down, people who have to manage electronic health records deal with a lot of these types of questions. We haven't necessarily taken that frame and applied it to different types of data. And so I often wonder along those lines, like if we could map what they've learned in electronic health records, is that, if that was a set of data and the health exchange is data, what does that mean for these other potential areas where we're trying to improve the exchange of data? All questions. I'm all questions.
Well, and I'm just sort of continuing down this meandering road. That makes me think of something I've sort of observed is sometimes there are different realms that are dealing with data, but they don't necessarily cross. So like, public policy for sort of, impactful policy making, that's one realm. Academic research is another realm. Use of sort of commercial data is another. And I've sometimes just, the more I see reference to this, the more I see these different pockets of conversations, and to what extent groups feel like, how well are those groups looking at the big picture, or are they looking at the boundaries that they're thinking about in terms of just thinking about the concepts, not necessarily the boundaries of the data, but is one's frame of reference one of those worlds or another?
Right. Again, I'm curious, given your position looking at this from a national agency, what are your thoughts on, especially thinking about that big picture piece where you could pull the data together and use it for multiple, to support multiple endpoints? What are your thoughts?
So actually, that's a great question, because we've just struggled with that. Our data is so not interoperable right now between our agencies that we struggle. We see there's so much potential, but we can't quite pull it together that it makes sense, right? So, right now what we've done is develop a national standard on research and development to help with that. It won't answer, every answer we have, but we're really trying to see how we can pull some of that data and really leverage a new technology than just really kind of descriptive stuff, but also maybe more the text analytics, maybe go beyond a standard and use the description of each project, right? To kind of tell us what is being funded, or what's being funded, where are the gaps, and where are the opportunities in the field of research in Canada. And that's, I'm just talking about what I know right now. I'm sure I know there's lots of other ways we can do that, but if we could do that, in the world to identify, or we already do this in a certain sense, but if we could do that better and more globally to really identify who we should be collaborating with, who are the experts in the other fields, where are there potential collaboration that are not your typical collaboration that would come out, but other ones. So the data could tell us and could really inform some of those decisions, I think. Does that kind of?
That really helps, and that's fascinating to me too, from like a policy angle. Thinking, I am in a former life, I feel like I worked in public policy, and it's figuring out how to bridge those conversations between the policymakers, the media, which often is a very different set, in the academics, and how do you pull those groups together, and to what role does this kind of data commons or a mechanism in the middle can help with that? And that I'm not sure.
Well, and I would add also, another example I think I just thought of is the impact of research that we do, right? Sometimes that's so down the line, it's really hard to tell how impactful that research was, as a funder, obviously. And so I think, when we talk about privacy and data sharing agreement, like that hasn't reached yet. It seems like that is lagging as opposed to the technology. And we're we're always dancing in between where we're like, oh, we could link up with this data set and this data set and really understand what's going on. But because of privacy issue and because of technology issues, sometimes it's really difficult to do that. But I think there's great ideas and they're starting to have better, but some of them is just so, it becomes such a high wall that the privacy and some, even though sometimes you're like, oh, we could do this with removing stuff, some people are really not there yet in that that understanding the benefit versus the risk, I guess.
I'm curious, does that suggest that perhaps there's a cultural component to this as well? And so, I mean, I don't know what those solutions are, but thinking about how we raise awareness on perhaps what's possible and what those mechanisms are. Often I encounter the privacy. I've been working in data dashboards for a very long time, and some people were like, initially it was like, look how cool and shiny. And then I feel like over the last 3 years, it's like, but the privacy, and it's a different initial reaction. And then we look at, in the US, we have things like the census team at the national level, and they're implementing differential privacy controls and kind of technical solutions to manage a lot of those concerns so that they can open up the data. And so I almost want to dive deep and have this very technical response of, oh, but there are answers. But I think there's a cultural fear element to this that we need to raise awareness around and potentially have more solutions, which, where Josh was, I don't know if he's on the call, but he started with the individual awareness layer. And what we're talking about is
Sorry, you said Josh, somebody?
Greenberg, early.
Okay.
Yep. When
I met him at one of the social events the other day.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So he was on the call at the beginning, and he was talking about kind of that individual ability to share data. And it's challenging because he had mentioned the Apple Health Kit as an example. Well, as an individual, I have a relationship with Apple. I can authorize Apple on my behalf to use my data for something else. But Apple and all the peers that it wants to partner with still need to figure out the mechanisms between themselves. And I feel like there's multiple layers at which we need to have this conversation.
I was definitely, and working for the government. So the government wants to really be connected between all its ministers, agencies, services, but yet we still act different, right? So that's an example that we're like, well, there's so much that we could link together and understand. What if I linked all the data of the people we funded with the tax data, like from 25 years ago, and but because of privacy, because of data interoperability, it becomes a huge project, right? So those type of things I think are very true, what you're saying, the culture, but also sometimes those hurdles that we have to jump over are just really big, and it's they're huge.
So perhaps, I know we have just 12 minutes left, or 13 here. One of the things I'd love to do, because this, when Cameron Neal and I were having this conversation, we're like, well, let's see who else is grappling with these questions. And is there something that we should be working on together? And I did have one other brainstorming board put together. Let me drop the link for that. It's also in the agenda. But to get a sense of, are there things that we could potentially be thinking about collaborating on, or should there things we be collaborating around? So let me pull that up here. This is under agenda item 4. I'm gonna drop this in the Zoom chat. I was told we have a hard stop at 5:30. The final.
Oh, and sorry, I'm just doing family management while I'm on the call also. So
you are okay. I feel like a terrible mom right now. You can see my 2 kids, that was about a year ago. But they actually are downstairs right now on screen. So I'm like, I will surface.
You're not a terrible parent. You are a human parent.
I was like, I have the door locked, so I don't see them pop in. Parenting in 2020. So hopefully, let's see, I should be able to just also bring everyone here. You might just magically move to the new screen because I have magic powers. Does everyone see a new blank screen that has an orange, red, green, and yellow quad chart? Wonderful. So this is where I wanted to kind of take the conversation today, was really, again, this exploration of should there be things we should be thinking about through the RDA specifically that we could collaborate on, where it might make sense to have another birds of a feather or even an interest group at the next plenary to come together and see if we want to progress some things in tandem. Whether that may be research, whether that may be like the birds of a feather where we're just building community, or are there other frameworks or standards or resources that could be useful? So if I could just take, same thing, 60 seconds, let's get our ideas up here, and then we can see if anything emerges. And if we don't have an idea, that's okay too. But I figured it was at least calling the question to see what we thought coming in after this conversation. I'd love to ask a question here. For the individual who put that investigating and developing things at a global scale, are there, when we think of things, what are you thinking of with respect to things? Are there specifically tools or resources or standards? Are there things that come to mind in let's say the next 3-year scope that you've been grappling with?
So that was me. And I put it right in the middle because I think it's not about one of those specific ones. It's more of an approach. And I think that what is great about the RDA is that I think many of these things going on may be either by design or just by omission, sort of nationally oriented initiatives. And so I was just putting in a plug for sort of whatever we do in these areas, trying to have a global orientation as much as we can.
They're global problems, makes sense.
And that's a unique thing that the RDA can do, whereas other organizations may by default be more nationally oriented.
Are there other organizations, I don't think we explicitly had this question, but are there other organizations that might be able to inform this?
I mean, you mentioned a couple like Open Data Institute.
I was gonna say, if anyone thinks of any, feel free to just drop them in as we go, because I think that's something, I know, Josh, I think I'd mentioned Mozilla Data Lab, which I understand is growing. And I think you might've mentioned a second, but I don't recall right offhand. So given what I'm seeing here, I'm curious, let me kind of have our last question here. What do folks think about continuing this as a birds of a feather group between plenaries, between now and the next plenary, and potentially putting this together as either a listserv or a Slack channel, something along those lines? We could just do a quick round robin. Do you think there's value in that at this point? Or even doing something more specific, like one of the things you see here?
I think something would be of interest, and I think that the number of people at this session may reflect just how many simultaneous sessions there are at the plenary, and I cannot imagine that we are the only people who care. And just for my own sort of understanding about the difference between if we were to continue as a birds of a feather versus an interest group, is a more formal version of that. Yeah.
And once the way in the RDA, so I've been an RDA member since 2013, and as you understand what your charter is, what you're trying to do, you can kind of mature up the ranks. So birds of a feather is great because it's like the informal networking, like here's who we are, we're not sure what we want to do, but we want to stay in touch. Once you have a charter and you know the direction you're going, an interest group makes a little more sense. You can say, we're trying to explore how to move forward in these areas. We started a little of that work on this last board that we were just looking at, like where are the areas where we might want to work together. If we had a specific project, such as create a framework on X or model policies on Y, that would be really well suited to a working group. But I think we're not, after these 90 minutes, I'm not sure we're ready to take that next step into an interest group. But I know I, for one, would find immense value into talking to all of you, or at least having a Slack channel to be like, hey, have you found a way to handle this? It's just having that network of resources would be incredible. And I should note, if any of you agree and also would be interested in the collaborative notes, if you wouldn't mind just noting your contact info. And if you don't want to have that in a public note document through the RDA, you're welcome to just send me an email and I can keep that in mind as well, recognizing that we're on a recorded video.
No, I agree that I think this could be beneficial, and I do think, and I'm not sure what the other sessions were, but it may have, maybe is it because it seems like, data collaboration, data trust, it's something everyone has to deal with, right? So is it already partially covered in the other, not specifically, but part of all of this? So and that's maybe why it's not there. But my question would be, is it too specific perhaps, or is it not specific enough that it's part of all of these other sessions in some ways, right? I didn't check what all the other sessions were, so I'm not sure. But yes, I do still think it would be beneficial. I think there's lots of things that we can do that, how can we better use data and collaborate between data? That's lots of people are trying to do that better. And if we can, leverage each other's experience, I think that's only great things, especially as we move, we're trying to do that more and more international, like across international boundaries, and there may be different rules and different things. So I think that can be useful too.
I would underscore because I think that's one of the biggest challenges and also the biggest opportunities for the RDA specifically, to think about how to enable that international sharing and innovation. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, recognizing that this has been a very long session, I think, I just want to welcome you. Can you tell it's the end of a long day on my end? I want to thank you.
And all of a sudden your room has gone dark behind you. It's
I know,
like a mental
right?
signal.
It's funny because I'm looking at my camera and I have my video on the screen right above. And so I looked up and I was like, what happened? I'm like, spotlight all of a sudden. So yeah, welcome to my sunset. Thank you everyone for just being so open and contributing. I know this was a lot. And I didn't have a presentation to watch, which made it even more effort. So thank you. And again, if you want to stay in touch, either shoot me an email or put your contact information. I'm going to go ahead and take screen captures of the boards and drop them into this note document so that we have it for others as well. And then my hope is, I personally, as far as action items will go, I will commit to following up with the other chairs of the other Birds of a Feather sessions that were noted on our last board to see where there may be overlap and see how they're continuing, in the hopes that maybe we could find a way to pull all of us together who are interested between now and the next plenary. So that's my action item. I don't know if any others had items they wanted me to capture in the notes, but you're welcome to share if you'd like.
I mean, something what Ariane, am I pronouncing your name correctly? All right. I'm happy to be corrected. So you were talking about other groups, and I was doing this in parallel with another RDA initiative I'd offer to just sort of skim through the list of working in interest groups and figure out which are the ones that this relates most closely to. Like, are there groups on, legal policies, for example? No, so that if at some point we wanted to reach out and think about the intersections, we have that as a list. Although if we don't have sort of a workspace, I could put that list in this notes or where I would put that, but that's just a small task I would volunteer to do.
That would be wonderful. And Katie, if you want to do that first, I'm happy to follow up with and take that lead and reach out to those that you identify in tandem with you if you'd like, because I think that would be a wonderful next step. Yeah, I'm co-chairing data stewardship, professionalizing data stewardship group, but I feel like that's far enough on the other side. So not
on the other side of.
It's more on the personnel and the data stewards as opposed to the organizational structures.
Oh, different enough.
Like, yeah, different enough. Sorry. I've been going since 8 o'clock and my brain's like, what?
Yeah, you should go.
I'm so sorry it's showing everybody. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time. And I want to make sure everyone at least has 5 minutes for a bio break and check-in. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end early here. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And Katie, I look forward to doing these follow-ups with you. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. I think many were names that I've seen, but I'm not sure if I've met you face to face yet. And this is as close as we'll get. So great to meet you.
Love it. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.